Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Anne, for that very flattering introduction. I think, possibly, I was just thinking about the lineup on the panel. It's sort of three horsewomen of the apocalypse and Mark Breguet. I'm going to talk to you about Britain, because that's what I know about. And just a few brief observations. The Gaza war unleashed in Britain a quite hallucinatory level of fury and hatred of Israel, which was terrifying to see in its virulence and intensity. This is because, as Anne has already, and others have already indicated, the Gaza war was seen as an entirely disproportionate attack by Israel upon the population of Gaza, with the civilians forming the majority of the casualties. This perception resulted in, on the streets of London, violent demonstrations. Night after night, the Israel embassy in salubrious Kensington was under siege from a mob of Islamists, far left and high-minded, shrieking, howling their support for Hamas and trying to storm the embassy before chucking bricks and other things through the windows of Starbucks, which has been known as part of the world Zionist conspiracy because it's owned by a Jew. On the streets, demonstrators posed with demonic, hook-nosed Jewish masks purporting to drink the blood of Palestinian babies. And attacks on British Jews rose commensurately throughout this period. Now, the remarkable thing about this whole episode was that the British intelligentsia had bought lock, stock and barrel the Hamas propaganda. Why had they done that? Because that Hamas propaganda was propounded as unchallengeable truths, unchallengeable facts, every day, day in, day out, by the British media, particularly by the BBC. I say particularly because the BBC has an influence which is unparalleled in the media in the Western world. The fact that Hamas was using the population of Gaza as human shields, the fact that Hamas was attacking the aid convoys and shelling the crossing points and so on, simply was not reported. Now, this hatred of Israel meant that the British, who, as you know, have been under militant assault from Islamism for some years now, did not see what was so painfully obvious, which was that the jihad had come onto its streets. In these demonstrations, there were Muslims throwing themselves to the ground in prayer. There were Muslims chasing the British police down the street, screaming, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. And people did not see what this was. People down the scale, with less education, less social standing, understood very well that what the Israelis were up against in Gaza were the same people as were on the streets of Britain. But the British intelligentsia did not see that. They took their cue from the universities, spewing hatred of Israel all the time, from the media, spewing a disproportionate hatred of Israel all the time, and from the government, which for some years has been steadily caving in to Islamism under the combination of fear and ideology, and as a result has absorbed to a certain extent, to a large extent, the Muslim narrative. During the Gaza war, a letter from so-called moderate Muslims effectively said to the British government, unless you call for a ceasefire immediately, we cannot answer for the fact that violence on the streets will increase from Muslims. Under this kind of threat, the government of Britain caved in. The government of Britain took the lead in formulating that UN resolution calling for a ceasefire from Israel, but not mentioning Hamas. And indeed, the British Foreign Secretary, David Miliband, called for a ceasefire on day 2, or certainly within 24 hours, of the Israeli jets going into Gaza. Now, why has all this happened? Very, very briefly, a whole variety of reasons which we might consider. The first and the most important, which underlies everything else, is monumental ignorance of the Jews, of the history of the Middle East, of the present day. The second is infantile leftism, a belief that the third world can do no wrong while the first world can do no right, which is, I'm afraid, fueled by the poison pumped out by Israeli revisionist historians, which is taken up by the enemies of the Jewish people in Israel and the West and used against their own people, something which the Israeli universities do nothing to correct, to their undying shame.
Arising from this leftist deformation of values comes moral equivalence, the idea that one cannot say that what the third world does is bad because they don't live by the same lights as we do to do with respect for human life. All deaths are equal, all values are equal, which actually hands the third world, the Islamists, the Muslims, Hamas, a weapon against those who seek to defend themselves against their violence, because the people who are aggressors under the doctrine of this moral equivalence, aggression becomes self-defense and self-defense becomes aggression. Arising from all that is a doctrine which has gripped the British intelligentsia, a belief in soft power, a belief that what causes problems in the world, stretching from prejudice at home to war abroad, is the nation-state itself. And so we have to be post-nation. We have to believe in transnational institutions, transnational values, which have an integrity, which have a legitimacy, which trumps our own. In this post-moral, post-nation, post-rational society that Britain has become, it follows that the United Nations is absolutely the repository of wisdom, goodness, and moral integrity. The United Nations, in Britain's eyes, acts as a supreme arbiter, a dispassionate arbiter between warring tribes, and what the United Nations says as the epitome of goodness and benignness. Everything it says is the word of unalterable truth. And so the fact that the United Nations has actually become a club of terror, as it were hijacked by the organisation of the Islamic Conference to put into action on the international stage the agenda of radical Islam. The fact that UNRWA, which manages those refugee camps, under whose nose they have been turned into factories of terror these several decades, the fact that UNRWA is closely associated with Hamas, since most of its operatives are Gazans, and most of them either belong to or under the thumb of Hamas, these facts the British people have absolutely no knowledge of whatsoever. And so, in conclusion, what we're facing is the result of decades of a refusal by Britain, by America, by Israel, to grasp the fact that the real battlefield we are on is the battlefield of the mind, that what we are up against, the most devastating weapon in the hands of the Islamists, in the hands of Iran, in the hands of Hamas and Hezbollah, is psychological warfare, to recruit on their own side through the promulgation of lies, whipping up hysteria, and through the promulgation of the same lies to demoralise a West which, for the reasons I've outlined, is only too keen to believe them. These lies, this defamation, has taken root in the universities, in the intelligentsia, in the media, and most important of all may be the Anglican Church, to become the default narrative of Britain. How do we all fight this? We have to fight it by telling the truth, by telling certain truths, the denial of which, I'm afraid, Britain, America and Israel have all connived in telling. We've all connived in denying these truths. The fight in the Middle East is not about two states. It's about an existential fight to destroy one state. That the United Nations is not the arbiter of progress, but the enemy of civilization. And that if Israel goes down, the West goes down. We can only win this thing if we actually change the narrative. And that means no longer going along with the foundational fantasies that we have all connived at for far too long. Thank you.